Steven?
Yes.
I just hit go live and it said you're out of minutes.
Let me try.
Hi, everybody. Welcome to night 2 of APUSH. If you guys can hear us, let us know in the chat and see us. Okay, great. Let me share my screen and we will get started. My name is Andrea Sanat. I am an APUSH teacher, have been for about 10 years, and I'm super excited to work with you guys tonight and share periods 4 and 5. Denilah,
Hi guys, I'm Denilah. I'll be sharing period 4 with you. It is literally one of like the messiest periods of American history, and I love explaining it, so I'm happy to show it to you.
Let me know when you can see my screen. Not sure if it's lagging or not, but can you see it yet? So now, can you see the slideshow?
I can see it.
Oh, okay.
The chat says I can see it too, so we're all good.
Okay, excellent. All right, so tonight we are covering periods 4 and 5. This is really the beginning of the 19th century. As Denilah said, it's really messy, lots going on concurrently, but we're going to break it down for you and try to make it as clear as possible. If you guys have questions, you can always ask in the chat. There's also a Q&A tab. Use that to ask like content questions as it comes up. And we have some hosts answering your questions, and they'll also let us know if anything comes up as we're going through the information that we want to address right then. So you can use both to communicate with us. Make sure you follow Think Fiveable on social, and we're going to talk a little bit more in a minute about a social media contest that hopefully you guys can all get involved in. So seems like a lot of you guys were with us last night when we went over periods 1 through 3, covered the Columbian Exchange, the colonial America, the Revolution, Constitution, taking us all the way up to 1800. So tonight we'll do periods 4 and 5. We're going to talk a little bit about analyzing political cartoons, and you can see the schedule for tomorrow night, periods 6 and 7, Wednesday 8, 9, and Thursday our big finale before the exam on Friday. As I mentioned, Denilah and I are going to be presenting information today, but the rest of our lovely hosts are here as well, and they'll be answering your questions in the chat. So I already went through most of this. After period 4, we'll do a little quiz. We'll have time for Q&A, kind of a dedicated Q&A time. And then we'll cover periods 5, which is the causes of the war, the Civil War, Reconstruction. We'll also look at multiple choice questions and how to use your time most effectively during the MCQs. And then again, of course, Q&A throughout. So how to make the most of a Cram finale. Hopefully you got access to our notes packet yesterday. If not, you can get that all in your finale or your Cram hub. Use the notes to jot down what it's going to help you to remember. We only have a couple more days until the exam. You don't need to take down every piece of information we have up here, unless writing stuff down really helps you to retain it. I would really focus on big ideas and like names and key terms as you move through the information. The Cram Hub, as I mentioned, has the access to the review packet. All of the slides will be posted. So again, don't worry about getting down every word because you'll have access to the slides. And also there'll be replays. So as soon as we finish up, there'll be a recording of this. So if at any time you need to take a break, please go for it. Take care of yourself. You can go to the bathroom. This isn't a class. You don't have to ask. And you can access everything. So, don't be afraid to take a little mental break if you need it. The group chat is for sharing tips, tricks, to participate when we ask you questions. Try to keep it, related to American history and to the APUSH. And the Q&A is for asking any questions based on the information we're going over. So you can use both of them as we move through. Community agreements, we went over these last night, but it definitely bears repeating. Please be supportive. We're all here to help each other. We're going to lift each other up. We're all in this kind of stressful environment preparing for this exam. So we just want to make ourselves feel good as we're working together tonight and over the next few nights. Be patient. There's some tech issues that always arise. You guys have been so wonderful with that. So thank you. We do have 5 nights together, so let us know in the chat if there's something you want us to go over, or there's a certain question about the exam you have, and we're paying attention, and we'll make sure to go over that in the next few nights. And be kind. We're all real people. We're teachers and students who have had long days at school, so you guys are too. So let's all, just support each other as we move through. Okay, last but not least, before we get into the history, we wanted to tell you guys again about Fiveable's social media contest, where you can post on TikTok or Instagram about your experience with these crams. So be creative. Make sure you tag Think Fiveable and use the hashtag FiveableCrams in your post. And if you make us laugh or get a lot of views, you could win $100, which can help pay for your AP exam or pay for something really fun for you to do after you're done with taking the exams. They're going to select winners throughout the next 2 weeks, so keep it up. We've got a couple more nights together. All right, Daniela, take it away.
I'll take it away. All right, so in period 4, we have the United States expanding their economy during the Market Revolution, and there's also territorial expansion influenced by the idea of manifest destiny, hold your applause, and it drives a variety of people westward. And then we also have sectionalism in the United States due to the issue of slavery, and that heightens tensions. We have further participation in society, the economy, religion, and politics increases during this time period, commonly known as the Jackson democracy. Overall, the United States is growing in leaps and bounds, and with that comes some severe growing pains and a lot of social and political conflict. All right, moving on. So we have the earliest political parties here. We have the first party system with the Democratic Republicans, primarily led by Jefferson, and the Federalists led by Hamilton. They emerged in the 1790s during the presidency of George Washington. The Federalists supported a strong centralized government, a strong economic system based on business and manufacturing, and the Democratic Republicans supported states' rights, decentralized government, agricultural-based economy. I also like to point out that they are distinctly separated between North and South, and we'll see this trend growing as we go through period 4 into the Civil War. How the differences between the North and South, almost from the rise of these political parties, heighten tension as well. I also wanted to add that the first party system was marked by a series of political conflicts and debates between the Federalists and the Democratic Republicans, including debates over the Constitution, the formation of the National Bank, and the issue of foreign policy. Okay. All right, so now we can move on to the Democratic Republicans. So in the Revolution of 1800, this is what I like to call the Federalist Mark of Doom. They all lost power. Everyone wants to know why. So first off was the Jay's Treaty, which was widely unpopular. It was negotiated by Supreme Court John Justice Jay and provided the settling of outstanding war debts and the regulation of commerce between the two countries, United States and Great Britain. It was establishment of a joint commission to settle boundary disputes. It was extremely controversial because it was seen by an attempt to appease the British and to preserve the fragile peace between the two countries. And as we've established, the United States and Britain do not get along. The laws, and we also move on to the Alien and Sedition Acts, which were intended to protect the United States from foreign influence and restrict the criticism of the government. These acts included the Naturalization Act, which increased residency requirements for citizenships from 5 to 14 years, and the Alien Act, which gave the president the power to deport any non-citizen deemed dangerous, and the Sedition Act, which made it illegal to publish any false, scandalous, or malicious writing against the government. You could see how these were controversial because they were deemed unconstitutional due to violations of the freedom of speech and seen as an attempt by the Federalist Party to silence their political opponents, and were widely opposed by Democratic Republicans. Once Jefferson took office in 1801, these acts were repealed. And then we also have an attempt at secession. We have an attempt at secession in the Hartford Convention by this group called the XS Junto, which attempted to break from the United States and form a Northern Confederacy with Canada. They also opposed the War of 1812, and for this reason, they wanted to secede. It was another one to undermine the authority of the federal government. It was widely unpopular, and it also widely contributed to the downfall of the Federalist Party. So once the Federalist Party is almost dead and in the ground, we have the era of good feelings, where there's only one political party, and the Democratic Republicans, and there is so little debate. The American economy saw great expansion. They saw a great expansion, and the government was able to resolve disputes with foreign nations peacefully. They also saw increased emphasis on public education and increased interest in the arts. It was a time of great optimism and hope for the nation, which does not last long. Okay, so now we're going to go on to Henry Clay's American system, which is part of the larger unit of politics and regional interests. So Henry Clay wanted a rechartering of the Bank of the United States, a protective tariff for the manufacturing sector, and federal funding for internal improvements. So what he got was the tariff of 1816, which is a tax on imported fabric, iron, leather, and paper, and the Second Bank of the United States. And Democratic Republicans argued that there was unconstitutional expansion of federal power, violation of states' rights, that the tariffs were harmful, that they're costly and unnecessary, but in their face, it set the stage for economic development. So moving on further into politics, we have three major court cases. We have the Marshall Court, which also defined and increased federal power, and there's also the Marbury versus Madison case in 1803, which established the principle of judicial review in the United States. In this case, William Marbury had been appointed Justice of the Peace by President John Adams, but his commission had not been delivered before Adams' terms ended. Marbury sued the Secretary of State, arguing that he had the right to commission. I'm so sorry. But he held that the Section of Judiciary Acts of 1789 gave the Supreme Court jurisdiction to order a writ of mandamus, which made the case unconstitutional because it attempted to expand the court's powers beyond what was provided in the Constitution. It established the court's power of judicial review and allowed it to declare laws and actions of the executive and legislative branches of the government to be unconstitutional. And there's another case in 1819, McCulloch versus Maryland, which was in support of the creation of a national bank, which argued for the implied powers of the Constitution. So remember when I was talking about the setting the stage of economic development? That is what happened in the market revolution. So to set the stage, the Industrial Revolution. It started in England, and demand for raw materials and textiles increased, which caused the growth of the cotton industry, caused the growth of all industries really, and led to the development of new technologies and manufacturing processes, which will be on the exam. Some of these inventions include the power loom, which increased the efficiency of the textile industry and the growth of large-scale factories. The steam engines, which revolutionized transport and industry and led to the growth of the cotton industry too, don't forget. There was Eli Whitney's interchangeable parts, how could we forget, which mass-produced goods and made them efficient and cheaper. And there was the telegraph, which had new communications and you could send messages faster, and Eli Whitney's famous cotton gin, which increased the efficiency of cotton, but also had the effect of having a greater reliance on slave labor. There's also transportation, which all facilitated the growth of commerce and industry and made the United States more connected. I remember on my exam writing an SAQ about this, and they specifically asked about the railroad and the national road. So like keep that in mind. So remember that the market revolution was a period of economic and social change that occurred in the United States in the mid to 19th century, like around the Industrial Revolution time. And during this period, the United States shifted from an agrarian economy based on small-scale farming to a more industrial economy based on large-scale manufacturing and industry. And the market revolution was driven by technological advances, mechanization, development of new transport networks, growth of banking, insurance, and other financial institutions. It also saw the rise of new cities and the growth of businesses and growth of a business class that was able to take advantage of the new economic opportunities introduced by the market revolution. It also had a large impact on the social structure in the United States and the growing industrial economy created by a large class of unskilled laborers and undermined traditional social structures based on family farms and small businesses.
Okay. So let's slow down a little bit.
Slowing?
Yeah.
All right.
Well, so there's a lot that happens in the market revolution. You're going over all of it really well, but they want to take it a little bit slower. Is there anything you guys, we can't go back, but we can break it down for you a little bit more. So you can keep going. Just they want to
Okay.
Yeah.
I was just looking in the chat to see if there was like anything specific I could go over like in greater detail. All right.
Re-explain the market revolution a little bit slower.
All right. So I'll go through this a little bit slower. Okay. So the market revolution marked Americans moving away from self-sufficient agriculture to production of goods for sale. Entrepreneurs played a key role in driving this economic transformation, and most of them embraced new technologies and business models and sought out new markets and opportunities for expansion. For example, the development of the steam-powered engines and railroads specifically made it possible to build large-scale transportation networks connecting the East Coast with the West and enabling growth of commerce and industry across the country. There was a question. Never mind. I also want to go over.
Do you want to hit upon that, just about how it affected internal migration? You want me to take it?
Yeah, take that one.
Yeah, so the infrastructure is really important to allow migration to happen. So from the very beginning of settlement, there were people moving west, but the roads and eventually railroads are going to enable people to move faster and more efficiently. So The canals that are being created during the market revolution are going to connect markets, right? So the way people buy and sell goods is going to revolutionize. That's why we call it transform how people are able to interact with goods and crops throughout the country. So, for example, a farmer in Ohio before the market revolution could really only sell his goods to someone who lives within a couple miles of him, right? Because all he has is maybe a horse or some oxen to get around. With the development of roads and canals, he can move his products much further than his immediate sphere. So now he's able to sell his grain, for example, to a middleman who's going to take it onto the Ohio River up to Lake Erie, and then across the Erie Canal in upstate New York, down the Hudson River to New York City, where now it can be sold to markets around the world. So that's the basis of the market revolution, changing how things are sold. That's going to impact migration because now you can move out west, you can become a farmer, and you can still sell your goods on a wide scale. So it's super important for internal migration, and it's going to impact Native American tribes as the white settlers move into this area. It's going to impact and lead to this growth of slavery, as she mentioned at the bottom of this slide, because they want to sell more products and there's such a demand for it. A little more about railroad expansion. We're going to hit upon that. This is the very beginning of railroads, but the railroads really will continue, and we'll talk about them more during period 6.
Okay, there was one question that I have seen in chat was the differences between Henry Clay's American system and Hamilton's financial plan. So Henry Clay's American system was a plan to develop the economy of the United States through the implementation of protective tariffs and internal improvements like roads and canals and a national bank. Hamilton's financial plan was a plan to strengthen the national credit by assuming the debts of the states and creating a national bank. The main difference between these two plans is that Hamilton's plan focused more on strengthening the financial infrastructure of the United States, while Henry Clay's American system focused on developing the economy of the United States.
More about Henry Clay. He was known as a lion of the Senate. He negotiated many of those slavery compromises. He was a Whig, so he's in the tradition of the Federalists. He believes in a strong federal government, and he's a really good foil to Andrew Jackson and the Democrats, right? Kind of wanted the opposite in many ways, and very supportive, obviously, of developing the economy through the American system.
Okay, what was the overall point of the market revolution? Oh, it was to transform the United States from an agrarian economy to an industrial one. It saw a surge of population growth, technological advancement, and economic growth. It had an increased concentration of wealth and power in the hands of a few individuals while the others were marginalized, which we'll explain in the other slide of the social consequences of the market revolution. Why did people oppose the market revolution?
Oppose the American system.
Oh, the American system. Let me go back. Okay, so they argued that it was an unconstitutional expansion of federal power. This is like an extension of the Democratic Federalist debates where we saw like limited government versus larger government. They saw it as a violation of states' rights. They said that the tariffs would be harmful for the economy and that the internal improvements like the roads and canals were costly and unnecessary.
Excellent. So let's keep moving because we got a lot more to cover in period 4, but we can definitely come back if some of your questions might be answered because all of these topics are very interrelated. But we'll come back and address anything in our Q&A.
Okay. The market revolution had a huge impact on many aspects of the social lives of Americans. It changed the way people worked, the types of goods they consumed, and the ways they interacted with each other. The industrialization of production meant that many jobs were replaced by machines and factories, which is where we see the rise in factory production. And it led to a continuing decrease in the number of agricultural jobs and an influx of immigrants to fill that labor shortage. It also meant that the social structure of the United States became more hierarchical, where factory owners and managers were at the top and laborers at the bottom. I saw a question earlier, is like, when did corrupt businesses come into play? This is probably when they come into play, like right about now. So the new economy had impact on the way people consume goods. They were mass produced and expensive. So clothing became readily available and gave way to a culture of consumption, which led to an increased focus on materialism. So if you ever want to tie it back to a type of culture spawning in the United States, you could tie back the social consequences of the market revolution to materialism. There was right. There is new working classes like the middle class and the working poor class, and the influx of immigration led to a greater surge in nativism and xenophobia, where you have groups like the nativists arguing against immigration and such. We also have increase of wage labor and the beginning of trade unions. And the market revolution created a new economy, which women had to take on women had to take on more responsibilities, including working outside the home to earn money, taking care of the home and family, and managing the housing finances. Where the shifts in responsibilities led to a decrease in traditional roles of women in the home, and also led to an increase of available jobs for women, which provided them with a little more financial independence and the ability to pursue their own interests and dreams. It could also create a new social network for women, like access to resources like education, employment opportunities that have been previously unavailable to them. And it also led to a rise of a new type of family structure, where it encouraged the idea of women having a more equal role in the family and egalitarian relationships between spouses. You'll see this later when we talk about reform movements and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, but it's because of because feminism is one of the social consequences of the market revolution. We also have the cult of domesticity, where because women were going more outside of the home, it was more like a call to action for women to become homely mothers and stay inside the home and be educated and whatnot. We also had the Lowell system with all the Lowell girls going out, and they were going out and getting jobs, which is a part of women going out and getting jobs. Sorry. There's also social mobility. There was great economic equality in this period as you started to create classes, and because there was limited, I want to say, regulation on these new industries. There was also social Darwinism, which is a new idea based off of Darwinism, that established that people function a lot like animals, in a sense, where there's a hierarchy from the top to the bottom, and people use this in order as racial explanations for slavery and also for manifest destiny. Did I go too fast?
No, I think that was good. I just want to reiterate what I always see asked about the market revolution is something about the changing gender dynamics. And your explanation, that was great. But for everybody, like, know that the social consequences and the changing of traditional gender roles for women is a huge important piece of the market revolution. Panic of 1819.
Okay, this is where like things go real downhill. So the Panic of 1819 was a financial crisis in the United States. It was from 1819 and lasted to 1821. It was caused by an economic depression in the United States, exacerbated by the collapse in the price of cotton due to overproduction and falling demand. It led to a series of bank failures, a drop of the value of the US dollar, and it was only further exacerbated by the Bank of the United States, which attempted to stem the crisis by tightening credit and increasing interest rates, which led to a contraction in the money supply, leading to a further decline in the economy. The Panic of 1819 was one of the first major financial crises in the United States and ushered in a new era of economic instability and financial crises. There was widespread business failures, unemployment, decrease in property values, and imprisonment for debt. And people in the West called for land reform and showed opposition to the National Bank because of the Panic of 1819. All right, so now we're moving on to America in the world stage. All of that was more of a setup to like Manifest Destiny, one of my favorite units. All right, so the War of 1812 is one of the more overlooked wars, but I feel like it's very important because I did get a very hard question on this on the AP exam. All right, so the War of 1812. So British ships would take American crews as their prisoners, impressing them into the Royal Navy to fight in the Napoleonic Wars. It obviously violated American neutrality, and it also led to the Chesapeake Affair, which a British warship, the Leopard, they would say, attacked an American warship, the Chesapeake. Jefferson, the president at the time, was pressured by war hawks in Congress and the Western frontier to act. He tried to do a peaceful coercion, which didn't work. And then he launched the Embargo Act, which prohibited all American overseas trade, which ended up hurting us more than it hurt them. So it backfired. So it ultimately led to war, ending with the Treaty of Ghent. We won, obviously, and it ended with a ceasefire. Nothing was lost per se because the borders would remain the same and they just stopped fighting. But it did prove that America could fight against a world power, and it was also used as a small push towards Manifest Destiny, because if we could fight against a world power, why can't we be one, guys? There's But contrasting that was like the Monroe Doctrine, which that America will stay out of wars until directly impacted, and Europeans aren't allowed here, and any colonization attempt is hostile. The Europeans didn't really take this one as seriously because they didn't really have the ammunition to back it up, but it was still a turning point in American global policy. All right, guys. Now we're getting into Manifest Destiny. This is like one of it was so messy. So the Louisiana Purchase in 1803 by Thomas Jefferson, major step in westward expansion. It was a major moment in the history of the United States, and led to the belief of Manifest Destiny, which was the United States is divinely ordained to expand across North America. I'm sure this political cartoon gives nightmares for some people. It does me. It was a major step in U.S. westward expansion and allowed the United States to gain larger controls of areas which could be used to expand its agricultural and commercial interests. It also allowed the United States to extend its borders to the Mississippi River, adding to its territory. And the purchase highlighted the idea of the United States as a manifest destiny nation, which would continue to expand in size and influence in the years to come. It also helped solidify U.S. control over the continent and establish the United States as a powerful nation in the eyes of the world. There was also the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which was after the Mexican-American War leading to the Mexican Cession. And this also had the same effect as the Louisiana Purchase, because not only did we defeat another world power, America, on top, but also we got a new territory. And so now you'll see an influx of people to the West trying to claim their manifest destiny and their freedom. And all of this manifest destiny leads to the Missouri Compromise because of all the land we got. So it attempted to ease the tension in the Louisiana Purchase territory, and it did so by establishing a separation of free and slave territories. This was a compromise which we all know would be is very fragile and would break which would break in the years to come in the Civil War. But for now, it was an okay compromise. Oh my God. So now we're going on to the Jacksonian era. So we have Jackson's come up. He is in the election of 1824. It is highly contested. People they're mudslinging their opponents all day, every day. And in the end, Adams won, but Jackson won in the election of 1828 because of not only the increased political participation in those last 4 years in the universal white male suffrage, which is exactly what it sounds like, where non-land owning white men could vote. It also marked the emergence of the Democratic Party as a dominant force in the United States. So now we're moving on to like our Andrew Jackson scandal roulette over here, where he continues to surprise me. All right, so first we had the spoils system, which he gave out government jobs to political supporters, regardless of their qualifications or experience. It's after the phrase "to the victor belongs the spoils." It gave him more of an advantage as people within the government would try to support him. So now we're going on to the tariff of abominations, which was the tariff of 1828. It was the first of tariffs. It was passed by a Congress controlled by northern states and signed into law by Adams, and basically raised the average rate of taxes on important goods to 20%. States were angered by this tariff, especially in the South, where it hurt plantation owners the most, because the tariff increased the prices that Southern farmers paid for manufactured goods and threatened to undermine their foreign markets by inciting counter-protection. So basically, these imported goods that the Southerners relied on increased in cost, protecting Northern manufacturers. And you can see how much this caused a sectional divide between the North and South, as Jackson's own vice president, John C. Calhoun, drifted apart from Jackson because of this change in beliefs. He turned from being a nationalist supporting states' rights to viewing these tariffs as like the opposite of beneficial. And then is the Nullification Crisis, where John C. Calhoun wrote the South Carolina Exposition in Protest, stating that states had the right to nullify any federal laws which they deemed unconstitutional. Jackson attempted to compromise by lowering tariffs, but South Carolina ended up nullifying these tariffs. The crisis reached the boiling point in 1832 when South Carolina passed an ordinance to formally nullify the tariff and threatened to secede if force was used to make them comply. Then Jackson passed another tariff called the Force Bill, which gave him the power to use federal military arms against the state if needed, just to enforce federal law. And then South Carolina then nullified the Force Bill, but accepted the compromise tariff. And then we have the big national bank battle with Nicholas Biddle, one of the strangest names in American history. Nicholas Biddle took over the presidency of the National Bank in an era where rising white males' democracy and obvious objection to the bank was that it posed a great power and privilege without being under popular control, that it assisted the wealthy, including President Andrew Jackson. And when the bank came up for recharter, Jackson vetoed it. He was not content with preventing the bank from getting a new charter and resolved to remove federal deposits from all Biddle's vaults. And he eventually declared war on it by giving deposit from the bank to U.S. pet banks, where basically Jackson ordered federal money cease to be deposited into the national bank and instead be placed into separate banks. He finally made a requirement that land had to be purchased through hard money. It required that all future purchases of federal lands be made in gold and silver. Then the banknotes lost all their value and land sales plummeted. All right, water. There was the Panic of 1837, a financial crisis that struck the United States and lasted for several years. It was caused by failing demand for cotton, a decline in land values, and economic recession. And Jackson's deposit of federal money into state chartered banks was a large contributing factor, since it led to a decrease in trust in the banking system. Most state banks also went bankrupt, leading to their banknotes becoming worthless and people using them becoming bankrupt as well. And then the Peggy Eaton affair, where in summary, Jackson used his kitchen cabinet, which was not his official cabinet. They were people he appointed that had less influence on policy than earlier presidents. So that was all like the fun little scandals that he caused, but now we're gonna go into like the horrible acts of crimes against humanity he committed. Like, first was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, right? Which allowed the federal government to exchange the Indian lands in the East for the lands in the West and pay money for any losses. We call it the Indian Removal, which ultimately led to the forced relocation of thousands of Native American tribes in the southeastern United States, including the Cherokee, Creek, Chickasaw, Seminole, and to the Indian Territory, which is in now present-day Oklahoma. There was also two court cases, Cherokee Nation versus Virginia and Worcester versus Virginia, which enabled the Cherokees to be labeled as some sort of ward to America. And the Supreme Court decided that this status allowed the Cherokees to stay within their land. Jackson, not happy with this court, he was not happy with this court's decision, and refused to let the Cherokees stay and enforced them to move to a new reservation in the Oklahoma Territory. The Cherokee strip to these new lands is called the Trail of Tears, and resulted in more of a third of them dying from disease, starvation, and exposure. Okay, water break. Now we can move on to the next slide. For all his faults, Jackson also created another second American party system, ending the supposed era of good feelings. It was led by Andrew Jackson, Calhoun, Martin Van Buren, and in the political tradition of Jefferson and Madison. They wanted state and local autonomy, opposed monopoly and privilege, low land prices and tariffs, and freedom from government interference. They were also located in the South and West, middle class and small farmers, and mainly Catholics, Baptists, Methodists, and free thinkers. And on the opposing side, we had the Whigs, led by Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, and John Quincy Adams, and William Henry Harrison, which generally followed in the political transition of the Federalist Party of Alexander Hamilton. They believed in national power, support for U.S. banks, high tariffs, internal improvements, and broad government role in reforming America. They were more in the New England colonies, they were more in the North. So again, you see this trend of sectionalism as the growing rift between the North and South begins here in period 4. Oh, there was one question of somebody confused on the first and second American party systems. The first one was the Democratic Republicans and the Federalists. But now this is a second party system. I'm not saying that they still don't exist. There are still Federalists and Democratic Republicans. But now the election of Andrew Jackson led to the second American party system between the Democrats on Andrew Jackson's side and the Whigs, mainly led by Henry Clay.
I think it's good to whenever we're talking about two different political parties, they shift and they change priorities, and the issues that are important to them shift as we move through history. But it's always good to come back to the Federalist and Anti-Federalist. So in the beginning, it was pretty clear, right? The Federalists wanted a strong federal government, and the Anti-Federalists were more about states' rights. So the political parties are going to change names. The Democratic Republicans become the new Anti-Federalists. The Federalists themselves die out. They reemerge under this new party name of the Whigs. But when you look down at the political beliefs, it's still going to be looking to the power of the federal government to address issues. The Democrats become the states' rights party, and they will continue to be that until the 20th century, when there's the shift, which we'll talk about on a later night. But don't get so bogged down in like tracing the evolution of the parties. If a question comes up, try to think about the time period and are they supporting states' rights or federal power? And you can usually figure it out based on that.
Right. I also wanted to add that most of what I'm speaking on in this presentation, what you really need to know are like how what social changes occur. Basically how social changes occur, internal migration, stuff like that. Like when you're asked about social changes, you're mainly going to be asked about Native Americans, African Americans, or women. And then when you talk about, I never had like an SAQ on Henry Clay's American system, but it's great to know because it does outline some of these debates that the Whigs and the Democrats have going forward. All right, so now I'm going to talk about the Native American resistance. So Native Americans did not just take the Trail of Tears lying down. There was a man called the Prophet, and he stated that Native Americans should reject all American settlers and goods like guns and alcohol, and from that, deities will allow the Native Americans to regain control of their land. And it was these ideas that led to Tecumseh's Confederacy. So his brother, I really don't want to mispronounce it. His brother was a Shawnee religious leader, and he preached a message of spiritual and cultural revival. And his teachings also influenced the Tecumseh's Confederacy, which was led by Tecumseh. All right. So we're going into the Battle of Tippecanoe, which is what I would use if I was ever talking about Native American resistance in this period. So these forces were led by William Henry Harrison and the leader of the leader of the Shawnees, William of Tecumseh. The USA won, which ended the dreams of a pan Indian confederacy, but forced the Native Americans to cede most of their remaining lands to the U.S. government. There was also the First Seminole War, which is a conflict between the United States and the Seminole people of Spanish Florida. And the Seminoles resisted the government's attempts to remove them from their ancestral lands, and it ended in the Treaty of Moultrie Creek, which required the Native Americans to relocate to a settlement. You will still see, as we go forward into this period, you will still see like the legacies of you'll still see the legacies of Native American resistance. I see someone talking about ghost dance. Was that like not like way? I think that was like a little bit further in, right?
Ghost dance was the 1890s, and it was dealing with different Native American tribes, but very similar idea.
Right. So now we're gonna go into more of like the social changes as a result of the Second Great Awakening. The Second Great sorry. The Second Great Awakening was more of like a response to the market revolution and imperialism. Not imperialism. I meant industrialization. Because reform movements sprung up in response to the consequences of the changing economy and increased territorial size. They believed that we as a nation were moving further from God. So then people pushed further into spiritualism and romanticism. from here, we have several reform movements. There was one, the temperance movement, where in 1826, the American Temperance Society was established. They believe that decrease in alcoholism in men will address the social ills that arose to prominence because of industrialization. There was mental health and prison reform by Dorothea Dix, who worked to improve the treatment of the mentally ill. And there was Benjamin Rush, a prominent figure in the Pennsylvania prison reform movement. We also have the father of the public American education, Horace Mann, which advocated for compulsory education, which is why all of us have to go to school and take APs to this day. There was also the Women's Rights Convention. The Women's Rights in 1848. There's a Seneca Falls Convention held by Lucretia Mott and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They said the Declaration of Sentiments, and I want to say that if you ever want to make a connection, you could connect that the universal male suffrage movement and the greater ideas that the expansion of voting rights caused women to think, hey, maybe I deserve to vote too, you guys. There was also abolition, which was a part of the effects of the Second Great Awakening, where religious leaders got more involved in abolition. In 1816, there was the American Colonization Society and the American Anti-Slavery Society, which had Frederick Douglass, William Lloyd Garrison, Angela and Sarah Gimke. Did I say that right? Gimke. I wanted to add that the ACS was with the goal of relocating free African Americans from the United States to the West African coast, particularly in a settlement in Liberia, motivated by the belief that free African Americans would be better able to thrive in Africa and the United States, where they face significant discrimination and segregation, and that immigration to Africa would help reduce racial tensions and promote harmony. They face significant challenges in their efforts to relocate African Americans to Africa, and many of them were unwilling to move to the United States, so they struggled to find funding and support for their efforts. There was also an abolitionist newspaper, The Liberator, by Garrison, calling for an end to slavery and for free states to secede from slave states. It had a significant impact on public opinion, making it a notable platform for Garrison and other abolitionists to support their ideas and mobilize support for their cause. There was also the Anti-American Slave Society, building support for the abolition of slaves through public lectures, publications, and grassroots organizing, and a network of safe houses for enslaved people trying to escape to freedom. They used these tools to educate the public on the evils of slavery and to convince people to take action against the institution. Did I miss it? No, I didn't miss anything. Oh yeah, the Underground Railroad was it was
Okay.
almost the Civil War era.
So this would be a great time to take a break if you need it. We're going to do
Maybe now this is time for everyone to go on break for 5 minutes, right?
Yeah, let's all have a little break. Don't worry, we are working on tech issues. Crowdcast will do this to us. Everything is okay. It's fine.
Yeah. So just come back at 8.
Please take a break to eat, drink water. I'll still be here to answer any like lingering questions you have before we move on to period 5.
Oh, okay. So like 8 p.m. EST, or I guess in 4 minutes now.
So many questions about the Underground Railroad. So it was a network of secret routes and safe houses established in the United States in like the mid 1800s. It was used by them, we all know, to escape to free states like Canada and help with the abolition. It helped with the abolitionists, and the system was established after the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, which made it illegal for any state or federal officer to assist an escaped enslaved person or face a fine. All right, that is a big nested question. I'll try to answer that like as best as I possibly can. All right. So the cotton gin led to the expansion of the slave trade because not only could you make cotton faster, but also you can make cotton faster, but also it led to a greater reliance on the South on cotton, which led to a greater I want to say separation between the North and South. Uh I would say loosely, like I don't think you connect the cotton gin to the displacement of Native American populations. Like loosely, if you wanted to say it, you could say that the industrialization led to the manifest destiny ideals, which led to the displacement of Native American populations. You could say that the greater expansion because of this technology led displacement of Native American populations. But I think the cotton gin is explicitly tied to like enslaved Black people. I'm not sure if we like go into the exploitation of natural resources in period 4, but this is especially when you start to see it because not only is there not that much regulation, these industries are just starting out, we're just getting into like the flow of things. So I would focus more on the exploitation of people, like let's like exploitation of like cheap immigrant labor rather than the exploitation of natural resources because we're not exactly there yet. Let me think about that question real quick. Let me think about it. I'll get back to you. I gotta think. I wouldn't use the terms interchangeably. I wouldn't use the industrial revolution, the market revolution interchangeably, but they were both periods of the industrial revolution, I would say, focused more on industrialization, and the market revolution was more of a period of economic expansion in the United States. They both, I mean, you could both say they both led to the emergence of like a new middle class, rise of an urban working class, and development of industrial cities. But if somebody specifically asked you about the market revolution, I'm pretty sure they're going to ask you about like social changes and specific technologies. Okay, so the nativists were like in the same realm. Okay, the nativists were like in the same realm of people, like in social Darwinism, who believed in the superiority of native-born people to the United States, or those who advocate or support the protection of the interests of such people. They were proponents of immigration restrictions and other policies that favor native-born citizens. But most often, when people said native-born citizens, they mainly meant like a specific type of native-born citizen. I don't think they really like. Okay, I'm not gonna make a broad generalization. I'm gonna hand it to the chat for that one.
Okay, I'm back. We still have a minute, but I also have access to the quiz. So everyone enjoy the rest of your break. And were there any questions for me? So now, do you want to take that one about what else to do to cram?
I will always like what else to do the cram? what I what I always personally I always recommend Heimler's history. I'm sorry. I can't do it. Also, the Quizlets people make online are so good. They help me study so well. I'd also recommend like the Princeton review packet. Um, sometimes John Green. Sometimes John Green is spin. Sometimes he really says some good things. Uh, I would I would specifically focus on like at this point moving forward, I would focus more on like doing practice tests online through like AP Classroom and stuff College Board puts out because you can do like content tests all you want, but if you don't know how the questions are asked or phrased, like you might not get the score you want. And yeah, Jackson's appeal was about him being an average Joe. He was like, I'm a small boy farmer from, and I don't know much about the big city, but I do know what is right. He had that type of energy. Oh, okay. Sophie, you asked like a really good question. Wait a minute. I had to think about that one for a little bit. So, so if we want to recap the era of good feelings, it was a period of national pride and unity following the War of 1812 and after the fall of the Federalist Party. The government invested heavily in public works, modernized infrastructure, and encouraged development of new markets and industries. And this investment and enthusiasm in the public helped create a climate that was favorable to the market revolution of that period, which led to that period of rapid economic growth in the United States. So really, it set the stage for like the period of growth and transportation and urbanization, industrialization. So really, the era of good feeling contributed to the market revolution because it provided the necessary conditions for the growth of the market economy. Okay, I'm back. I just couldn't see the chat, everyone. I'm so sorry. I couldn't see the chat. If I'm muted, I just really need to take like a big gulp of water, and I don't want that in my mic, please. Oh, okay. Demand for crops increased because now because everybody wants all these crops, right? And now because we already have the technology to make it in a we can mass produce these crops. If you can mass produce them, people want more of these things. You know? It's not that complicated, you know? It's just there was because of the rise of tech and industry, the demand for crops increased, thus the demand for industry increased, and so on and so forth. You know, it's like a circle.
Delilah, maybe you should screen share because I don't think Andrea's slide is gonna come back.
All right. Am I good? Is it sharing?
Yep, you're good.
Oh my god, let me turn on the music. Oh my gosh. No.
I can hear
You
music.
not hear the music.
No,
Yeah.
is my tab muted? Am I crazy? No, no. Is there a trick to this? Just hum in your head. Just hum in your head. Wait.
So maybe we should start the quiz. I think everyone's in the quiz. Or
so we're all-
start joining late.
All right, guys, I'll start the quiz.
I see everyone now. Can you guys see me?
We can see you. We can see you.
Okay, yay.
You know, for the people who cannot, I will.
Nyla, I can hear you.
I'm sorry. What did you say?
I don't think I can hear you.
Oh, okay.
You can lower the music a bit. On the,
All right, we're gonna do 10 more seconds
How
and
did
reveal the
President
answer.
Jackson respond to his vote for Cherokee versus A. Not uphold the decision and forcibly expel the Cherokee from their land. B. Issue an apology to the Cherokee Nation for his actions and credit them citizenship of the United States. C. Step down as president. D.
Daniela,
Issue
mute
a
the
written
music.
mandate to the natives and successfully overturn the decision through executive action.
Daniela, can you hear me? Okay, yeah, lower the music and you can mute it when you're ready to talk. Daniela, can you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you.
You're running the quiz, right?
Yeah.
Okay, I'm not doing it, so you can hit reveal answer now that most people have answered, and
Okay.
when you're talking, mute the music so everyone can hear you.
Got it. All right, so I think we all mostly got that one right. The 3% who there's 3 and 7%. I think the writ of mandatus was another action Andrew Jackson did. Can somebody back me up on that?
Can't see it.
But
Oh, here
if we ever talk about Andrew Jackson, just know it is never the reasonable option. The man never apologizes. And he once said, and I quote, his one regret was not killing his vice president and the what was it? Henry Clay too. Horrifying guy. Love him.
All right, next question.
What historical event led Andrew Jackson to being viewed as a national hero by much of the American public?
All right, lock in your answers. right, let's go for it.
It was the Battle of New Orleans, which I believe was a part of the War of 1812. Am I right about that?
Yes, the War of
Okay.
1812. Yeah. Although the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the war was won, but no one told Andrew Jackson. They didn't have Twitter back then. So he fought the war and he gained national fame, but the battle had no impact on the war.
But like he won though, so it doesn't really matter. He won. What group did Andrew Jackson get the most support from?
Once we get to 200, let's go.
It was the common people. I believe most people got that right. To dispel your misconceptions for people who picked A and C. Before Henry Clay and Andrew Jackson were notoriously enemies, and Northern bankers would probably oppose Jackson the most because he was more of a citizen of the common people. Like, just remember, he was like a small town guy growing up in like the big city.
Also, he vetoed the national bank. So these northern bankers were definitely opposed to that move. They would like the stability of the Bank of the United States.
All right, next question. What was the Trail of Tears?
All right, that's 100. 100%, yes.
Let's go, you guys. I'm so glad. I'm so proud of you. Which of these states was President Andrew Jackson met with because of the tariff abomination?
Yeah, this was the tariff of 1828. People from this state called it the tariff of abomination, including Andrew Jackson's own vice president.
It was South Carolina. If you remember the slideshow, that was the state that was really itching to secede from the Union and just kept vetoing every single thing Andrew Jackson was telling them to do.
And the vice president I mentioned, John C. Calhoun, he was originally senator from South Carolina, then Jackson's own vice president, and they really broke up over this issue of the tariff.
It truly was heartbreaking. What is the theory of nullification? All right. The theory of nullification is D, is the theory that states can ignore laws they see as unfair. Think South Carolina. Anyone? All right. Next question. Oh no. I mean, what political party was created to oppose the policies of Jackson?
Yeah, I'm just gonna, while you guys are answering that, quickly answer a question from the chat. Solitary neglect is the time period when Great Britain was basically allowing the American colonies to do whatever they want. Solitary is like beneficial. So that ends with the French and Indian War. Nullification is just the idea that a state can say, whatever the federal government does, we're not going to follow it. It's null and void to us. So this is laying the groundwork. South Carolina is the first state to secede in 1860 as well. So they're kind of setting the stage for this belief that they don't really believe they need to follow what the federal government says if it contradicts their own beliefs. And in this case, it was about the tariff, and then later it's going to be about maintaining slavery. That's good. Okay, continue.
The heated debates over the tariff of 1828 and additional tariffs in the late 1820s and early 1830s showed that all right. It was that sectionalism was a serious problem to keeping the Union.
Can you explain sectionalism?
Not well.
Okay, I can do it. So we have different sections of the country, and this goes back to, we talked about yesterday, the different colonial regions. The North and the South, they have different economical interests and different political interests. Those two are intertwined because of slavery, basically. So the American system was a way to bring them together, and that's why we talk about this period as balancing nationalism and sectionalism. So in what ways can the country come together? And in what ways are they, really apart? So when we talk about rising sectionalism, we're looking at all of the little cracks in the Union as they build and build and build to ultimately the Civil War, which we're going to talk about next. Do you want to wrap up the quiz and go back to our slides and talk about political cartoons a little?
Yeah, let's do that.
Okay. All right, so you can stop your screen share and I'll pick it up again. Okay, it should be loading. You can preview a little bit as it's coming up what to expect with political cartoons.
All right, so I'll give you guys a minute or so to think about the. Okay, Everyone's saying not the. All right. Everyone's seen this political cartoon. I get it, but I like this one. And it's good practice. And so like let's all ruminate on this idea.
Listen, you guys are going to see political cartoons both on a short answer question. It could come up. You'll have one with the stimulus, and you'll see them on multiple choice questions as well. So it's definitely beneficial to just see how to analyze a cartoon and then also how to answer a short answer question, best practices. Yes, can someone remove the quiz link from the screen in the questions for us? Thank you. All right, Deniala, go for it.
All right, I'll take it away. So when we analyze political cartoons, we have to think about the point of view of the person. We have to think about if anything sways between overly positive, negative, or kind of neutral. It's like I want to think of it as like watching your favorite TV show and noticing something new in a clip. You know what I mean? What you have to do is you have to analyze what the point of view of the person, and you have to analyze the political context in which that person is placed in. So if we go into like the first essay, SAQ, it's sorry. It says briefly explain the point of view that the author has towards Andrew Jackson. So number one, what should come to your mind first and foremost is that normally when people are like portrayed as kings or queens in America, it's a negative thing. You'd have to be aware of that political context. So when you say point of view, what I would do personally in my SAQ is that I would use the words point of view. I would say point of view, Andrew Jackson is abusing the veto. Right? That's what I would personally use as my basis to write my SAQ. And I know this is going to come up. This is going to be a question that will come up. SAQs should be between like 3 to 5 sentences. I think 5 might be a little generous. 5 is a little generous. I would like to stick within the range of 3 sentences. That's good to go. And so when you get a political cartoon, you have to analyze a piece of historical evidence that would support the author's point of view on Andrew Jackson. What I would you get a lot of you get a lot of evidence by examining the political cartoon. If you don't know anything, I would personally try to use the political cartoon's words in my SAQ. If you really know nothing about Andrew Jackson, I would say something about unconstitutionality, the veto, how he's standing on the Constitution. Like if I knew nothing about the subject, I would personally, I would use the same thing A, B, and C, but use it to answer that question. You gotta think big on this one. All right. So when you're asked to explain one piece of historical evidence, what I learned from analyzing AP Lit and doing AP Lit is that what College Board might be looking for here is that they want to give you the point. So as long as you use like the you have to use like the prompts like words. Like I would go in and highlight like, okay, we need historical evidence that supports. You got it. And then when you move on to question C, you would have to explain one piece of evidence that would challenge the view of Andrew Jackson. So that is when you have to put on your critical thinking caps and think about the type of people who would like Andrew Jackson. I would say Southerners, common people. When you get a political cartoon like this, you'll normally get a date, you'll get the title of it. So there isn't that much, like there's a lot of complexity that goes into it, but I would I think I might have said all I need to say. I'll open it up to the chat, or if anybody would like to add anything to what I've said before, that would be nice.
I want to expand it a little bit and just say political cartoons in general. This short answer question is how you should think about political cartoons and the types of questions you'll probably see around a multiple choice with a political cartoon stimulus. So when you're looking at a political cartoon, you want to read the caption. In this case, it says King Andrew the First, veto power, born to command, right? Like, usually political cartoons are written with satire or verbal irony, and so they really are saying one thing, but they mean the opposite. So make sure you're identifying what is the point of view of the artist, right? Are they critiquing something? Are they in support of it? And use the caption and obviously any imagery in the cartoon to help you figure that out. Then you want to think about, like, what is this time period? What is this talking about? What does it relate to? In this case, right, we're looking at Jacksonian democracy, and you can use any of the content, the information that Daniela went over to support this point of view that Andrew Jackson is a tyrant, right? That is the point of view, that he has abused his power, that he has trampled on the Constitution, which you see at his feet here. So any piece of information that we went over can help to support that. One point of view that challenges, one piece of evidence that challenges that point of view is going to be opposite. Andrew Jackson's super controversial, and he does not fit neatly in a box. And so he's a great figure for this, because it's like anything you say about Andrew Jackson is true. But in general, with political cartoons, they're going to take a side, and make sure you identify that side before you answer the questions, because they'll often ask, and which groups would support. I've seen this same cartoon with a multiple choice, and it asks, like, which of these groups would support the artist, and it was like Westerners, like Western farmers, right? So that kind of the common people, common man who would support him. You need to figure that out to understand which side the artist is on. Okay, because we lost a little bit of time, we're gonna skip this Q&A for now, but we'll come back and we'll have time for a Q&A, and we'll cover everything as we go. But I want to make sure we have enough time to cover period 5. So period 5 is 1848 to 1877. Just like period 4, it's 15% of the exam. So you will see several questions about period 5. Could have multiple choice questions, a short answer. You could have a DBQ or an LEQ on this time as well. This is the Civil War, but the lead up to the Civil War is included, as well as the aftermath of Reconstruction. So I'm going to take you guys through that now. As always, throw your questions in the chat, and I'll take breaks at the end of each slide to try to address some of them. So the causes of the Civil War are beginning to brew in period 4. A lot of the information that Daniela went over is crucial to understanding the ultimate breakup of the Union and the succession of the Confederate States. She did a lovely job talking about the Missouri Compromise, which was a compromise proposed by Henry Clay. Someone I saw called him the King Compromiser. He was very much known for that. And it set up this line across the United States, 3630, that would allow any states below, south of that line, to be slave states, and close any states north of that to slavery. In 1820, they thought, oh, we solved it. As we continue to expand west, we'll just defer to this line, and any state that comes in will know whether it's going to be slave or free. This was messed up in 1848 with the winning of the Mexican-American War. and the purchase of the Mexican cession. So that land included Texas was part of it, separate, but that was added to the Union, as well as New Mexico, Colorado, Arizona, and California. California is a huge state that is both above and below the Missouri Compromise line. So in 1849, you had the California Gold Rush. So 1848, California is added as a territory to the United States. 1849, their population explodes. Everybody goes there. They want to get some gold. This leads to a very quick turnaround time for California to apply for admission to the Union. You need to reach a certain population threshold, and they do that within a year. So when they apply for statehood, it throws Congress totally out of whack. They don't know what to do because it's both north and south of the Missouri Compromise line. So Henry Clay, which, if you can believe it, he's still in the Senate. He's pretty old by this time. Comes up with this Compromise of 1850. This didn't just, it wasn't like, oh, let's do this and it'll make it through. They debated and argued and talked about the Compromise of 1850 for 8 months, and they could not agree on it. It was only when Henry Clay broke it up into kind of piece by piece legislation and had each part be voted on individually that they were able to get it passed. So the big pieces of the compromise that you need to know. There's lots of little pieces, but the big key takeaway: California gets admitted as a free state, and that is a huge boon to the free state, right? It's dealing with the balance in the Senate and the Congress. The Southerners get a strengthening of the Fugitive Slave Act. So there was already a Fugitive Slave Act passed in the 1790s. That, again, was that first little crack showing you can't have a country that's half free and half slave, because slaves will escape to free states and then they should have their freedom. Southerners say, no, they're our property and they belong to us. And if they go to a free state, they still need to come back. So Southerners felt like Northerners were disregarding this. And so they strengthened this law in 1850, and they made it, it's pretty brutal what they did. They deputized anybody to catch a runaway slave. They gave the benefit of the doubt to the slave owner. So you didn't even need to prove that somebody was a slave, but you could just say, that person is my slave and they ran away, and a judge would take their word on it. And then they also offered money to the so if you've seen the movie 12 Years a Slave, I think it was also a book that was based on a true story of where a free Black man was taken into slavery and he couldn't do anything about it because of this fugitive slave law. Northerners, especially in Massachusetts and upstate New York, where the abolitionist movement was incredibly strong, were very upset by this. And Northerners in general felt those who could ignore slavery, even though it was all around them, felt that the Fugitive Slave Act really put it in their face, and it made them complicit in it. And so it made them people who could kind of just get by with, well, I don't see it, I don't have to deal with it. Now it was being put in their face. This image, right, fugitive slave law, read and ponder, was part of a campaign to raise awareness about this fugitive slave law. Another compromise happened later in 1854, and that's the Kansas-Nebraska. Similar idea. You have these big territories in the Midwest that are applying for statehood or getting ready to apply for statehood, and they're both above and below the line. So they passed this law that's based upon an important idea called popular sovereignty. And popular sovereignty says we're going to leave it up to the people to decide, right? Before, whether a state would be free or slave, it was Congress that was deciding it when they were admitted to the Union. So in this case, they say, well, just let the people vote. We're going to give them the sovereignty to make this choice. This led to some extreme violence, which I'll talk about on the next slide. But this idea of popular sovereignty, again, was like, oh, we figured it out. Like, we're just going to let the people decide. All of these compromises were stopgaps that did not work, right? There comes back to the ultimate idea that a country cannot be half free and half slave states. Some catalyzing events that you need to know about. Harriet Beecher Stowe, whose father was a preacher, part of the Second Great Awakening, publishes the book Uncle Tom's Cabin, which really personalized slavery for Northerners who were like unaware of what it did, what the toll that it took on not just but their owners and people who were, again, complicit in the institution. There were also many slave narratives that were published, including Frederick Douglass's slave narrative, and he escapes to the North and becomes, he's on this abolitionist circuit where he's talking about his experiences and bringing that experience home for people. He was also an incredible speaker, very witty. People like loved hearing him talk, and he used kind of his pulpit to spread about the evils of slavery to Northerners who, again, didn't have day-to-day interactions with it. Dred Scott versus Sanford was a really important Supreme Court case decided in 1857. One of the worst Supreme Court cases decided, maybe until recently. We have some other bad ones, but this was decided by this guy, Roger Taney. He was the Chief Justice at the time, Southerner, and an avid racist. The facts of the case that are important is that Dred Scott was an enslaved man. Takes Scott with him to Indiana, which was a free, or Illinois, I believe, which was a free territory at the time. He takes him back, and Dred Scott sues for his freedom. He says, I was just in a free place. You can't bring me back as a slave. Roger Taney and the Supreme Court at the time bring down a ruling in 1857. So we're really close to the Civil War erupting. The violence of the 1850s has been building, which I'll talk a little bit more on the next slide. But this is like a political event that really hardened both sides. The Supreme Court decision first says that Dred Scott, as a Black man, is not a citizen and he has no right to sue in the court of law. So he's kind of just saying, like, flat out, there is no validity to his argument. He also goes and takes an axe to the Missouri Compromise. And he says the Missouri Compromise prohibited slavery in certain parts of the United States, but that's unconstitutional because the Constitution protects someone's property. And so you can't close off any parts of the United States to slavery. This really validated Southerners, especially slaveholders, was that it was their institution and it could not be gotten rid of. And it enraged Northerners who felt like they were moving in the wrong direction. Lincoln-Douglas debates are important to know for a couple reasons. One, Lincoln kind of emerges onto the national scene in his debates against Douglas. Also, you have the formation of the Republican Party. He runs for Senate in 1858 and he loses, but because of the platform he gains, he's unable to run for president in 1860, and then the Civil War happens after that. But Douglas, the little giant, he was kind of a big barrel. He was a huge proponent of popular sovereignty. So both of them are kind of talking about what are we going to do? They had this debate over slavery, and Lincoln comes in and kind of crystallizes the idea that he is against the extension of slavery into the territories, but also doesn't believe that he can change it because it is protected by the Constitution. So, increasing violence in the 1850s really foreshadowed the violence of the Civil War as it was to come. So, before we talked about the Kansas-Nebraska Act, again, Stephen Douglas and others said, oh, this is brilliant. We're going to leave it up to the people. What they didn't expect is that senators, politicians from both sides would tell everybody, you need Kansas ballot for our side. You need to go be pro-slavery. You need to go be anti-slavery. So there was this huge rush of people into Kansas. A group of anti-slavery people settled in this town, which is now Lawrence, Kansas. And they created a settlement there. And then pro-slavery people settled in other places. Basically, it emerged into a mini war. There were people from Missouri, a slave state, who came over the border. They were aptly called border ruffians, who would just come in and mess with the anti-slavery people. At one point, it got out of hand, and they burned Lawrence to the ground. Nobody was hurt. I think one person died because of like a piece of wood fell and hit him in the head, but no like direct murder or killing of anyone. But a rumor was started that 5 anti-slavery people were killed during the sack of Lawrence. And so John Brown, who was comes in and he says, I'm going to avenge those people who were killed. He picks out 5 people, right? He hears 5 anti-slavery people killed. He says, I'm going to kill 5 pro-slavery people, pulls them out of their house and hacks them to pieces with broadswords. This is the type of violence, right, that emerged in Kansas from this idea of popular sovereignty. So this idea of like democracy, let the people choose, devolved into this brutal violence and basically this mini war. This is more and more kind of pieces and elements adding to this idea of we cannot this even comes to the floor of the Senate, the supposedly civilized institution, the upper chamber of Congress, where Charles Sumner, who is a Republican, is giving a speech. And the speech is actually called The Crime Against Kansas. So he's talking about the violence of Kansas and kind of leaving it to the people there. And you can see in the political cartoon here, a representative from South Carolina, Preston Brooks, comes to the floor of the Senate and beats Sumner over the head with a cane until he knocks him unconscious and ultimately ends up in a coma. Charles Sumner survives. I don't know how he did it in the 1850s when this happened, but he survives and ultimately comes back to Congress, and he's a major part of Reconstruction. But this again shows like an inability to compromise. Like that time of compromise was over in the 1850s, where Brooks felt a perceived slight against his uncle, I think, and so he beats Sumner over the head in front of everybody. Northerners are saying this is Southern chivalry, right? Like that's kind of their critique in this political cartoon. Whereas Southerners start sending canes to Preston Brooks as like a little souvenir, right? Like, we're with you. That was awesome. Last but not least in the increasing violence was John Brown's raid in Harper's Ferry. So after the massacre, he kills the people in Kansas, he escapes and he goes back to the north and he's hanging out with the abolitionists, and he's really revved up about slavery, and he believes that the only way it can be gotten rid of is with blood, and he says that pretty overtly. he decides he wants to lead a slave revolt. And ultimately, it's unsuccessful. He doesn't actually involve any enslaved people. Like, he doesn't tell them that it's what they're really caught off guard. He doesn't do great planning. Him and some of his sons, I think he had many children, steal into Harper's Ferry, which was a federal arsenal in Virginia. I think at dawn or in the middle of the night, and they go to steal some weapons, which their plan is to then get into the hands of enslaved people and kind of begin a rebellion. They get tipped off, and so then federal troops come and capture John Brown. Trial for treason, and again, this trial captivates the nation. To Southerners, he is evidence that Northerners will stop at nothing to end slavery. That all kind of everything that they've been whining about, that the Northerners are trying to take away our slaves, has come true, has come to fruition. And so they feel very validated in the execution of John Brown. Northerners see him, right, as a martyr, right? He's basically dying for the cause, and he says he's fine with that. And his famous last words, which I think we'll read them a little bit in the next few slides, or later. Let me just see what my next one is. Okay, so before I get into this, I haven't been looking at the chat. Big questions. Summarize what I said. What is Harper's Ferry? Harper's Ferry is a federal arsenal. It's where they stored weapons, and where John Brown tried to begin a slave rebellion. Oh, I've been cutting out. Oh no. Yes, if you know the big ideas, you will be good. Okay. All right. So, do you hear me? Charles Sumner is anti-slavery. He's a senator from the North. He eventually will be part of the radical Republicans. Okay. I'm gonna try. Okay. Give me a thumbs up if you can hear me better now. Yeah? Okay. All right. Sorry about that, guys. There was a lot in there. So the big ideas, right, are increasing violence and this idea that the country can't continue to function the way it is, and the violence was evidence of that. So the Civil War, there's not going to be much on the Civil War. They'll focus more on the causes and the effects. So, like, don't get bogged down in the details. Abraham Lincoln is elected in November of 1860. And immediately after the election, states begin to secede. So, you don't need to know military history, but I just put those in there because they kind of sum up the war for you. So 11 states secede, and by 1861, they form the Confederate States of America, which is based on this idea of slavery. The institution of slavery will be protected, states' rights. They don't want a strong federal government. They want states to kind of retain the control and power. Fighting begins at the fighting of Fort Sumter. Abraham Lincoln, in the beginning of the war, his primary purpose was to get the Union back together, to
All right, guys. I'll be screen sharing. I will take over. I'll take over the slide and any other slides I need to. Just give me just a single moment to refamiliarize myself with period 5. All right, just give me one moment.
While we're waiting, why don't you guys ask some questions in the chat, and then Zoe and I could answer them.
I can help you too. You want me to share my screen for you? Or you got it?
Oh, yes, please.
Okay, so the difference between radical Republicans and normal ones, I think I answered it in the chat, but radical Republicans wanted to punish the South for like being anti-abolition. Punish the South for like terribly. Like they wanted to like just they wanted to they weren't really moderate about their approach to Reconstruction. They wanted to get straight to it. But the more like normal Republicans, for say, advocated for like a really transitional and gradual like approach to Reconstruction, and they were heavy on like a slow return to help repair the Union. But radical Republicans wanted to punish them, and they wanted like aggressively return to Reconstruction. And then Nyla, you can take it away.
Okay, so I'll take it away from here with the election of Abraham Lincoln. So Lincoln, as a Republican, was determined to stop the spread of slavery out west, and the South erupted in horror. They thought that Abraham's leadership would stop the spread of slavery, embolden abolitions in the North, and attack and even possibly provoke northern states to attack southern ones and to attack slavery in southern states. The election of 1860 was the South's political weakness because a Northern Republican could win the presidency without a single electoral vote from the South. I want to move on to like in an effort to stop some of the impeding secession. Some of the lawmakers proposed the Crittenden Compromise. I'll spell it out in chat at some point. But it's supposed to extend the Missouri Compromise line beyond 3630 westward and to California, and made slavery illegal in territories north of the line, but would have allowed territories in the south of the line. Essentially, that this compromise failed to get enough support from either side and was never passed from Congress. And all of this, like, everything that we've been everything in period 4 up until now to Abraham Lincoln's election has been boiled up to secession. All right. South Carolina, who was famously known for trying to secede, is the first state to secede from the Union in 1860. And the rest of the South followed like dominoes. It does not matter. Do not focus on the order in which they fell. I think you might just have to know that North Carolina fell first. But all you need to know is that the South seceded and quickly. And there was fast. And Lincoln wasn't even inaugurated before they seceded. That's how much tension there was. So all the southern states created the Confederacy on the basis of white supremacy against the fear that Abraham Lincoln would interfere with their slaves, either out west or down south. And they elected Jefferson David as the president of the Confederate States of America. The start of the American Civil War was at Fort Sumter when the rebels attacked the federal arsenal at Fort Sumter in South Carolina, attempting to force the Union to station there to surrender. This attack was the major catalyst for the outbreak of the Civil War and rallied northern opinion behind the Union cause. It put the call up for like 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion and caused the Upper South to secede as well because they opposed the use of violence to force fellow Southern states back into the Union. What you need to remember from this, Fort Sumter was the site of the first shots of the American Civil War. Who attacked at Fort Sumter?
I'm gonna unshare my screen just really quick so that we can get it fixed.
Okay, I'm back.
She's immediately frozen. Man, it's like this Wi-Fi is like study for APUSH? Nah. We're gonna make it work. She was right there. It was right perfect.
So upsetting. I will not lie. Civil War battles are not my forte, but I am trying. I am pushing through.
It's okay. We're not going to spend much time on them.
I don't think the battles are the most important, but what I do think we need to summarize is not only is what I remember most from APUSH. Leave me alone. That's my sister. Leave me alone. They're talking about me. What you need to know most is that the Southerners took like the Northerners as like a real aggression. Like they used all out total war on the South. Total war, just to define it, is to describe a conflict where all resources and capabilities are mobilized for the purpose of achieving military victory. So they use all available economic, political, and social resources, the mobilization of the industry, the use of propaganda, and the conscription of soldiers to move this event forward. They needed this. The South wanted a short war, and they needed European support. They were sure Great Britain would support them because they needed their southern cotton, but the British just got their cotton from Egypt and India instead, so that really didn't work out for them. What can you do? And the North had more resources and could afford a longer war because the South was not expecting the war to go on that long. So they used something, it was called the Anaconda Plan, which strangled the South's ability to trade or receive resources through naval blockades. And the idea was to blockade all ocean ports on the Atlantic and the Gulf and the ports on the Mississippi, which you cannot neglect the importance of the Mississippi River to this day. So it really just constricted the South like an anaconda snake. So the advantage, so I want to go over like North and South advantages. Let me see if that's on like another slide or no. Okay, just making sure we're on the same page.
Yeah.
So the North had Okay. The Union hoped that its population against the its population was like 22 million against the 5.5 million in the Confederate population. So it would work for a war of attrition. But in the South, it had stronger military leadership under Robert E. Lee, something that the North did not have in the war. If you remember anything from APUSH, is that they were a mess. They were a hot mess. They were not getting any doves, not a single one. But the Union like dominated its economy. It was the banking capital. It held most of the factories, 70% of the railroads, and like 65% of the farmlands. But the Southern economy was less adaptable because it did not have that industrial base. So the South it depended on the outside world for most of its manufactured goods.
I don't know why these slides are not showing up for people. I would just suggest refreshing. This is kind of annoying.
Yeah, don't worry. You get access to this live afterwards. So if you ever need to take notes, you need to refer back to it. It's all good. All right.
Perfect.
It is all okay. Just stick in the chat for a while. If you need a question, I'm definitely sure to answer it. All right. So I want to go into Civil War turning points. Okay. The South was winning many battles under Robert E. Lee as the war, but the North finally improved its leadership under USS Grant, and its superior resources helped win key turning points that changed the tide of the Civil War as a whole. There was the Battle of Antietam in 1862, which was the bloodiest day in U.S. history and led Lincoln to issue the Emancipation Proclamation, which keeping Europe out of the war and changing the Union Army into an army of liberation. Its freed slaves was now contraband or property taken from those breaking the law, and added African American manpower to the U.S. Army, which they probably desperately needed in order to move forward. There was also the Battle of Gettysburg, which kept Europe out of the war again, and it was the Confederate high water mark. The girls were on the defensive after this. Lee lost like a third of his army and led to the Gettysburg Address, which was Lincoln's statement that the U.S. would have a new freedom and a new birth after the war and would end slavery. This and then the Battle of Vicksburg were the turning points of the war. Okay, I just need to relax my mouth for a minute. Oh my god.
You're doing a great job. There's so much to know for APUSH, so much that I know there's like a lot of content within all this.
Yeah, but don't worry. The the Battle of Gettysburg, the Gettysburg Address, and sometimes the Battle of Vicksburg are those are the turning points. If you don't remember any other battle, don't remember anything else, remember the Gettysburg Address, remember Vicksburg, because this really launched their whole scorched earth policy. They were going, the North was really going around total warfare. Scorched earth referring to how much of the South was burned during the Civil War. And it was really it was a turning point in modern warfare also, because you see the use of new technologies and tactics that would become commonplace in future wars, like the ironclads, which were steam-powered ships. Steam-powered ships made of iron and steel that were able to withstand the impact of cannonballs, and obviously much more difficult to sink than wooden ships. So, and they were built and used by both the Union and the Confederacy during the Civil War and played a significant role in the outcome of that conflict. It also saw new weapons like the Gatling gun, which is the one I remember the most, and the beginning of trench warfare and the repeating rifle. Guerrilla warfare, I might have to refer to somebody else for that, but I know it was trench warfare. But if you're referring to guerrilla warfare as in they were going all out total war, when I say they were playing around, they were not playing around.
I'm back.
Yeah. Okay.
Don't leave my
No, you're doing
side.
amazing, Daniela. You can come take my job.
Thank you.
In school, you're good. Did you talk about Emancipation Proclamation?
I talked about the Emancipation Proclamation, the Gettysburg Address, and I was going over the new technologies and turning points, the new technologies of the Civil War. I was just about to end it with trench warfare, and then we could have moved on to the end of the war.
Okay.
Come on, guys.
Okay, wonderful. So I'm sharing my screen now, and I'm really hoping I fix whatever my issue was. So the Civil War is a really important turning point, but what happens after I find a lot more interesting than the war itself. So the Confederacy, I saw some people in the chat talking about the Anaconda Plan. That was the Union's military strategy. It was successful. They cut off the southern states with a naval blockade. Vicksburg was incredibly important because they split the Confederacy in two in Mississippi River. They couldn't get supplies in from Texas and Arkansas. And the South was basically starving. They didn't have an influx of people to fight, whereas the Union Army had a huge contingent of like foreigners, like newly arrived immigrants who were drafted right into the war as they arrived in the 1850s. But the Southerners, it was getting very bleak. And by 1865, General Lee surrendered, and the war was over. One of the saddest pieces was Abraham Lincoln was assassinated very shortly after the end of the war. And so he didn't really get to implement anything after. So Reconstruction is the 12-year period after the Civil War that dealt with two main goals. One is to bring back the Confederate States into the Union. And number two was to help integrate the former slaves into society. That's politically, economically, and socially. Reconstruction was this short time, it's only 12 years. It had a lot of successes, which we'll talk about, and also had a lot of failures. The failures were more lasting and more enduring than the successes, but let's break them down. Another important piece in timing is there's two phases of Reconstruction. The first was presidential Reconstruction. So as I mentioned, Abraham Lincoln was assassinated at the very end of the war. His plan was a very lenient plan. It was also known as the 10% plan. And the idea was that only 10% of people in the Confederacy needed to pledge an oath of allegiance to the Union, and then that state could be readmitted to the Union. 10% means one out of every 10 out of 100. It's a very small amount when you think about the total war that just took place and how many people were fighting in the Confederacy. After Lincoln is assassinated, you guys let me know in the chat if I cut out or anything, please. Andrew Johnson is his vice president. He takes over. Andrew Johnson was a Democrat to Lincoln's Republican, and he was also from Tennessee, which was a slave state. He chose him as his running mate to appeal to the border states, which were slave states that hadn't seceded from the Union. So now all of a sudden, the country is left with a Democratic president who, he was not a slave owner. He was actually grew up really poor, and he hated the slave owners. He thought they were just like these rich a-holes. And you have a radical Republican Congress. So the radical Republicans are really intent on bringing African Americans into the fold, into society, and making, helping to improve their lives. They do everything they can to hurt Andrew Johnson, including impeaching him. He's the first president to be impeached, but he's not removed from office. Once they impeach him, though, they move into what's called congressional Reconstruction. So this is led by the radical Republicans, who are really leaning into equality for all. And Reconstruction could have been this amazing rebirth of our nation. And some of these successes I want to talk about, kind of show you what could have been. So the Reconstruction amendments are incredibly important. They set the scene for, in many ways, the next 100 years. So 13th Amendment abolishes slavery, except for punishment as a crime, which we'll see in some convict leasing issues in a minute. The 14th Amendment is birthright citizenship. So it specifically is passed at that time to give former slaves citizenship and to say if you're born here, you are a citizen. And this, extends until today, obviously. There's also an important piece of the 14th Amendment that gives equal protection under the law. And the 15th Amendment gives voting rights to Black men. And an important piece of the 14th and 15th Amendment is this expansion of federal power. The 14th Amendment says no state may make a law that denies or abridges someone's equal protection. The 15th Amendment says no state can deny you the right to vote based on your skin tone or your race or previous condition of servitude. So these are turning point amendments because they are, if you look at amendments 1 to 10, the Bill of Rights, they're all saying things that the federal government can't do. And the 14th and 15th Amendments say these are things states cannot do. So it's a major turning point for the power of the federal government. The federal government is trying to integrate slaves into the political process, former slaves into the social scene and political and economic with Freedmen's Bureau, which we'll touch upon. The Civil Rights Act, the Reconstruction Act, all part of congressional reconstruction and really set the stage for Reconstruction in the South, where federal troops basically set up 5 districts and they controlled those areas. And that was because the resistance from white Southerners was extreme. We'll talk about that in the failures in a second. One of the major successes of Reconstruction was an interracial democracy. With the 15th Amendment giving voting rights to Black men, you had many former slaves and free Black men who are participating in democracy at the state level. South Carolina is a majority Black population. They have a majority in the state legislature during this time period. You also have Hiram Revels, who's elected to Congress, is a senator from Mississippi. You have basically Black men serving at all levels of government, right? From all the way up in the federal government to the state governments to deputies, sheriffs, like everything. And this is a really nice part of Reconstruction, even though it's really short-lived. It doesn't last past 1877. Freedmen's Bureau, I did want to touch upon as well. This is established in the beginning, even before the war ends, and the purpose was to help integrate the former slaves into society through education, throughout slavery, slaves were prohibited from learning how to read and write. And so as a teacher, this is one of the most beautiful things. But after the war, they set up these schools all throughout the South so that former slaves from all ages, like young people and then older people, could go and learn how to read and write. And as we know, their world was just opened up from there. They also trained them on like reading business contracts and how to start their own businesses. And it was definitely not a perfect thing. Probably no government agency ever is. But it did help improve people's lives in the short term. The failures of Reconstruction sometimes overpower the successes because they were much longer lasting, and many of the issues or the failures of Reconstruction will last 100 years, right? Whereas the successes only lasted those 12 years. So the first is sharecropping and Black codes. So the Southern states, in order to be admitted to the Union, had to ratify the 13th Amendment, abolishing slavery. And then through congressional reconstruction, they had to ratify the 14th Amendment. So what they did was start to pass state laws, known as Black codes, that restricted the new freedom of the former slaves. The Black codes were very similar to the slave codes that were passed first by the colonies and then the states, that just tried to legislate or tried to regulate all areas of their life, right? Like you couldn't be loitering, right? So you like couldn't be walking down the street. You couldn't own firearms. They also are the beginnings of segregation, right? Where you had to have separate facilities for Black and white people. And these were passed by states. So state laws did that, even though they kind of blatantly contradicted the Civil Rights Act of 1866. But the important piece here is the federal government had very lofty ambitions. They passed a lot of laws to protect the former slaves, but they didn't enforce them very well. And so ultimately, what ended up happening was former slaves were put back into slavery by another name. So sharecropping is a good example. Sharecroppers were tenant farmers. So landowners who were previously were slave owners now took their land, they broke it up into plots, and they allowed their former slaves to farm that area and their land as long as they paid the landowner a share of the crop. So that's where sharecropping comes from. They often, the former slave owners would make them sign these agreements, these contracts that had very bad terms for the former slaves, but if they, didn't read them close enough or they weren't able to read, they were locked into this like long-term tenant farming where they never made a profit. They had nothing, so they had to borrow money, and then they were locked into this cycle of debt that was very difficult to get out of. Many sharecroppers were stuck in that system and their children after them. And it wasn't until the Great Migration, where they left the South and left farming entirely, that they were able to escape kind of that system that they'd been put in. The formation of the Ku Klux Klan and the White League, as you see in this political cartoon, were groups of former Confederates who basically took the law into their own hands. They did not like the federal laws that were protecting African Americans. And so they created their own vigilante justice where they would terrorize and intimidate and murder African Americans and also white Republicans. So people in the South who supported Reconstruction. There were several hundred lynchings throughout the South in this time period. That's going to continue in the early 20th century. And the threat of lynchings really stopped that interracial democracy we talked about. And we'll take a look at a quote from that time period in a little bit. The New Orleans Massacre, 1866, was another example of violence and intimidation against Black voters. This was specifically on an election day that African Americans were going to vote Republican, and so these Southern Democrats came in and killed them. And that happened with regularity in this time until the Southern states were able to pass legal avenues to prevent African Americans from voting. So that's literacy tests, poll taxes, and the grandfather clause. Literacy tests were arbitrary, ridiculous tests where you would go to register to vote, and basically a registrar would say, take this test. If you haven't seen one, I suggest you Google it. You probably can't pass it. They were very just like ridiculous questions that didn't make sense. And it was also all left up to the registrar. So they could look it over and say, yeah, you didn't pass. The poll taxes were just that. They were fees that you had to pay in order to vote. Eventually, they'll pass an amendment to the Constitution outlawing poll taxes. You shouldn't be prevented from voting if you can't afford it. The grandfather clause was a loophole that Southern states created to get around literacy tests for poor, uneducated white people. So if you were like a poor white farmer and you didn't know how to read, you wouldn't be able to pass that literacy test in order to vote. And so they created this clause, the grandfather clause, which said, if your grandfather could vote in 1860, you don't need to pass the literacy test. You could vote, you're fine. And the caveat there is that that was before slavery was abolished. So you wouldn't be able to vote if you were Black in 1860. Last two big pieces is, how did this all end, this Reconstruction? These hate groups like the KKK and the White League thoroughly terrorized the South, tried to push the newly freed slaves back into submission until they could get the Northern troops out of the South. And they did that with a political compromise. The election of 1876 saw a very contested election between Rutherford B. Hayes, who was a Republican, and Samuel Tilden, who was a Democrat. And they weren't sure who won. And so basically they come up with this backroom deal where the Democrats say, listen, you could take the presidency, Rutherford B. Hayes could become president, if you promise to pull your troops out of the South and allow us to return to home rule. For states' rights people, this home rule was incredibly important to them. They wanted the ability to implement Black codes, to prevent African Americans from voting, and they wanted white Democrats to be in charge. No more interracial democracy. The Northerners, the Republicans, agreed to this. And the big question is, my students always ask me, is why? Why did they give up on Reconstruction? By 1877, the conviction, the belief in helping newly freed slaves had been decreasing, had been waning, and a new issue had been emerging in the Industrial Revolution, and that is what's called the labor issue. In 1877, you have a huge railroad strike that freezes business activity across the country, and so the federal government sends troops in to deal with that strike. And so they're like, you know what, we can't deal with this Reconstruction anymore. We have to deal with labor and all these the issues that are arising from industrialization. And we'll talk more about that in tomorrow night in period 6. Plessy versus Ferguson is not during this time period, but it fits thematically during Reconstruction. So in 1896, the Supreme Court issues a decision that solidifies segregation in this country. So the Black codes that different states had passed included one in Louisiana that said if you were Black, you had to ride in a separate train car. And so Homer Plessy, who I think he was 1/8 Black, he was very light-skinned, he was chosen to challenge this law, specifically to show how arbitrary race is. And he goes and he buys a first-class ticket, and they tell him he has to go sit in the back, and he refuses, and he's arrested. And it goes up to the Supreme Court, and he says, a separate train car is violating my 14th Amendment right to equal protection under the law. And the Supreme Court issues their decision. I'm sure you guys remember the separate but equal idea is that it doesn't have to be together, integrated in order to be equal. Ultimately, we know things were not equal, and we'll talk about that more when we do the civil rights movement. But this Supreme Court case allows for the Black codes and segregation laws and Jim Crow laws to proliferate throughout the South and basically lead to the issues of segregation that will be addressed in 1950s with the civil rights movement. Okay, I didn't look at the chat the whole time. So I'm coming back in. My hosts in the back, are there any big questions that you want to send to the screen? Or should we
have to reload so I can see the chat again. So maybe I'm thinking the silence is a no.
Okay. Could I summarize the end of Reconstruction? Sure. So Reconstruction ends officially in 1877 when the federal government pulls troops out of the South. So starting with the Reconstruction Acts in 1868, I believe, they had set up 5 military zones throughout the South where federal soldiers were there ensuring that Reconstruction was being carried out. So the compromise basically is Democrats say, we'll give you the presidency, the Republicans, if you pull troops out of the South and let us return to home rule. And basically the South turns in on itself. It passes all the Jim Crow laws, and it does everything that they can to subjugate the former slaves. New Orleans Massacre, you don't need to know that specifically, but rather the idea behind it is that white Southern Democrats did everything they could to prevent African Americans from voting, including literally killing them at the polls. So that was like the most overt way, but then you also had intimidation. It wasn't until later that there was like secret ballot. So when you would go vote, people would see who you're voting for. So imagine there's people standing there with rifles, with guns, right? Like looking at who you're voting. So voter intimidation was rampant at this time, and it led to violence or lynching if you didn't vote the way they wanted you to. Okay, it's 9:34. Let's do a couple questions on this quiz, and then we'll come on back to multiple choice tips. Okay, here we go. Can you guys hear the music?
Yeah, we could hear it.
Can you see the quiz?
I could see it.
Okay. All right, I'll give you guys 45 more seconds to join. I love Warriors Don't Cry. It's an amazing memoir by Melba Fields, who was one of the Little Rock Nine. Highly recommend that book. When giving outside info on the exam, do we need to give specific dates and years? No, you never need to give dates. If you know them, of course include them. If you're not sure, I always say, go to a century. And you remember that it's the second half of the 19th century, right? The late 1800s. So you can be a little bit more broad to give some context. But if you don't know the date, don't guess, don't make it up, because you don't want to be wrong. All right, some of you are asking for the link. There it is. Yes, you can say something relative to something else, but your example is opposite. The Battle of Gettysburg came after the Emancipation Proclamation. Emancipation Proclamation was January 1st, 1863, and Battle of Gettysburg was July of 1863. All right, we are going to get this quiz started. Okay, there we go.
All right, guys.
You can see it.
Which of the following was a key factor that contributed to the rise of sectional tensions in the early 19th century? Okay. Was it A, the expansion of slavery into new territories? B, the growth of manufacturing in the North? C, the development of new transportation systems? Or D, the establishment of new religious communities?
All right, we're going to use 150 as our threshold. So, excellent. The expansion of slavery into new territories. You will see a question like this, connecting Manifest Destiny to these debates on slavery. So now you want to read it?
Mm-hmm. Which of the following statements about the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850 is true? A, it was widely popular in both the North and South. B, it granted fugitive slaves the right to trial by jury. C, it required all citizens to assist in the capture and return of runaway slaves. Or D, it led to the creation of safe houses for runaway slaves.
Okay. All right, well, let's talk about this one a little bit. The correct one is required all citizens to assist. This is what I meant by deputize. That gives people the power to be slave catchers. So they had like the right to go and grab someone and say, you're an escaped slave, and bring them in. B is incorrect because it took away any right to a trial by jury. Basically, a judge just had to say, yeah, you are escaped property. A lot of people chose D, and this is the creation of a network of safe houses is what's referred to as the Underground Railroad. That existed before the Fugitive Slave Act of 1850, and it continues after as well. Next question.
What was the primary reason for John Brown's attack on Virginia? A, to become the new president of the Southern Confederacy. B, he wanted to capture land for a railroad. C, he planned to start a slave revolt. Or D, he wanted revenge on the former residents of Kansas.
All right, we're at 150. Okay, he wanted to start a slave revolt. So Harper's Ferry was in Virginia. All of the violence that took place in Kansas was like 3 or 4 years earlier. The revenge on the former residents of Kansas was the Pottawatomie Massacre. That took place in Kansas. But they're just different places and different times, but he did want revenge and he did plan to start a slave revolt. Just need to know the slave revolt was Harper's Ferry, Virginia, 1859, and the revenge was 1856, I believe, in Kansas. Let's do 2 more.
The decision in the Dred Scott case did all of the following except stated African Americans were not citizens, guaranteed the full citizenship of African Americans, stated the Dred Scott was not free despite living in free territories, or stated that the Missouri Compromise was unconstitutional.
I love questions except. So you want to use process of elimination here and find the one that's not true. So this Dred Scott case said African Americans were not citizens. They had no right to sue in a court of law. The case said that Dred Scott was not free, even though he had been living in a free territory. And it said that the Missouri Compromise line was unconstitutional, that the federal government had no right to ban slavery in certain areas because that would constitute taking away someone's property, and property is protected by the Constitution. So B is incorrect. Throw in the chat what guaranteed full citizenship of free African Americans. Which amendment was that? '14th. Excellent.
What concept allowed for territories to choose whether to be slave or free? A, the Homestead Act. B, exodusters. C, popular sovereignty. Or D, nativism.
Okay, good. Popular sovereignty. Darren, did you talk about the Homestead Act? And that was when I cut out.
I don't think I talked about the Homestead Act. Oh my god.
Okay, that's okay. Really briefly, while the war was happening, there were still things going on. I remember learning about all this stuff happened in the 1860s, and I'm like, wait, there was a Republican president with a Republican Congress that passed a lot of stuff, including the Homestead Act, which basically encouraged settlement of the West, and it gave like really cheap free land to people who are going to move out and build a homestead out west. So unrelated to slavery, but happens in 1862 around the same time. Okay, so we only have like 15 minutes left, so I'm gonna pause on this quiz. And we'll go back to the slideshow so we can talk about some multiple choice strategies and tips. Okay, so multiple choice, whoops, this is wrong. Let me quickly change it. Multiple choice is actually 40% of the exam. And you have 55 minutes to answer 55 questions. This is the first part you're going to do. So often this is when you're the freshest. But there is a lot of time management that's needed in these questions. You think that it would equate to about a minute a question, but multiple choice questions are organized around a stimulus, and then there's a set of questions that are based off that stimulus. So the stimulus most often will be a primary source. And we're going to look at a couple of those and how to handle those today. It could also be a secondary source, and I'll touch upon that and how it differs from the primary sources. And you could also have a political cartoon, like you saw earlier, or a graph or a chart, sometimes a map. All of those, it's going to be based on kind of the image and what they're showing you. So in your set, you'll have 2 to 5 at the most questions based on that stimulus. So you want to be able to move through the sets as quickly as possible to give yourself time to get through all of the questions. Couple just little tips I always tell to my students as you're moving through, and really important to keep in mind. Make sure you bubble your answers as you go. You're going to have a Scantron. You want to make sure you're in your question book, you're answering the questions. You can mark it up as much as you want. No one's going to look at that. So do what you need to do to comprehend the questions. But once you've come to an answer, bubble it in on your answer sheet. If you're unsure of a question, take an educated guess, lightly bubble it in on your bubble sheet, and move on to the next. Circle it in your answer book. If you have time, you can then go back and look at it. My only fear, and I've seen this happen to my students, is they're working in the book and their plan is to go and bubble at the end, and then they run out of time, and then you don't have anything on that answer sheet. So bubble as you go, take educated guesses, and move on, because there'll be more that you'll know and have better chance at getting. You don't need to get every question right to get a 5. So try your best, but just keep it moving. And then last little piece with that is, I don't know, I lost my train of thought. So for primary sources, there are some tricks to cut down on the time that you need to spend reading the source. So what we're doing over these couple nights is going over all of this content and introducing you to kind of the big ideas, the people. Hopefully you read a lot of these documents throughout the school year in your class. And so that's kind of coming back to you as we're talking about things. They're going to give you primary sources that have to do with the topic, but don't necessarily relate to the questions. And I see most often with my students, them getting really tripped up on reading through and trying to understand this primary source. And then the question is not even asking you to read the primary source, but it's just asking you a broad question about Reconstruction. So thinking about it more from College Board's point of view, they know they want to ask you these questions on the cause of the Civil War, on Reconstruction, on Andrew Jackson, and then they find primary sources to match. So the most important piece of information they give you is the source. So read the source information first. What does that look like? We're going to go through a few of them now, but this is the source. It's at the bottom of the passage. Address of John Brown to the Virginia court at Charlestown, Virginia, on November 2nd, 1859. So that'll give you who said it, when or where they said it. Is it written in a book? Was it a speech? Was it a political campaign? Whatever. And when, right? The year. So you don't need to memorize dates. They give you the date, but you should then be able to put that into context. In this case, 1859, or right before the Civil War. So read the source information, identify the time period, and then go right to the questions. See if you can answer the questions without reading the passage. Sometimes the question will ask you, like, how does this explain the point of view of the passage? And in that case, you might have to read it. But test yourself and see, can you answer this question without reading the passage, without wasting the time on the passage? So I want to be super duper clear. This is for primary sources only. A primary source is something that was written in the time period in which it's talking about. Secondary sources will also show up a lot on the multiple choice, but secondary sources will be passages, there'll be little paragraphs from a historian's book. unless you've read that historian's book, and if you did, that's awesome, then you need to read that passage. You need to read the excerpt from the historian and identify what their point of view is, what they're talking about, what they're arguing. But the questions, again, are going to be broadly about the topic, and sometimes I'll ask you, like, what's the main idea of this historian's excerpt? So just really want to be clear on that. This tip is for primary sources only. So we're going to take a look at 3 primary sources and show you how I would break them down. And I'm going to do it really quick because we're running out of time. So don't come at me for going too fast, but this will all be posted on the slide. So, address of John Brown to the court. This is his address that he did right before he was executed for trying to start a slave rebellion, right? We just went over that. So, the questions that this would be about are going to be about the cause of the Civil War, the violence of the 1850s. It could also be about abolition and his views on slavery. So, you know now, if something about John Brown, right, it's going to be about his push, his desire to end slavery. And it's 1859, so we're dealing with pre-Civil War. President Abraham Lincoln, Emancipation Proclamation, January 1st, 1863. When it's government documents like this, hopefully you don't need to read it at all because you know the gist of it. You know, based on what we talked about today, Emancipation Proclamation ended slavery in the areas of rebellion against the United States. The questions are going to be about this military strategy, something about the Civil War, and potentially a question about what actually ended slavery throughout the United States, which would be the 13th Amendment. You guys can't see the passages? If some people can see, so if you can't see, I would refresh your screen. Yes, I apologize, the font is tiny, but remember, you can access these slideshows and you can get access to these. You can also Google them. That's where I pulled them from. The last one is something I referred to when we were talking about the failures of Reconstruction. So this is one that's not as well known, right? It is congressional testimony from Abram Colby, an African-American legislator from Georgia, 1872. So first, the year tells you this is during Reconstruction, right? This is the time period after the war dealing with interracial democracy. You have an African-American legislator. You might be able to answer the questions just based on what we talked about of the successes and failures of Reconstruction. You can also skim through the passage if that helps you. You can read through and see, in this case, he's giving testimony about the violence and intimidation that he's facing for voting Republican. And it's a kind of a question and answer. It's an interesting primary source if you can go and look for it. All right, we only have about 5 minutes left, so I want to give a little bit of time for a Q&A, but just know that on Thursday, we're going to have a lot more time to break these things down, and hopefully we won't have any tech issues, and then we'll answer any questions you have as they come up. So my host in the back, can you send any big questions for me or Daniela? So most important dates, we just did this in our class, and I have a bunch of my students here if they want to put the big 4 wars in the chat for us. I would use the Revolutionary War, the Civil War, World War I, and World War II as your anchor points. And so knowing those dates, right, when those 4 wars happened, you'll be able to place kind of everything. Oh, that was after the Revolution, but before the Civil War. And that'll help you to kind of contextualize this big timeline. Louise, put the dates for the 4 wars in.
Someone asked for like a quick overview of political parties in period 4. You only have to remember the 4. In period 4, there are only the 4 political parties. We have Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson going at it with the Federalists and Democratic Republicans. And then afterwards, after the Federalists, they don't disband, but they lose popularity. We have, please, not Hamilton, please. We have the the Democrats versus the Whigs. We have Andrew Jackson on the side of the Democrats and Henry Clay on the side of the Whigs. Did I say that right?
Yeah.
All right. Those are the only 4 you really need to know. The Democrats follow the same vein as the Democratic Republicans. The Whigs are more like the Federalists.
And then picking up from period 5, you have the emergence of the Republican Party. In the 1840s, there's a bunch of political parties. They all had little different interests. You don't need to really worry about them. If they come up, they're going to give you the information about them. But just know they were all divided on the issue of slavery. Ultimately, a lot of them come together and coalesce around this Republican idea, which is to ban the extension of slavery in the territories.
Okay, the Embargo Act. It was an act placed right before the War of 1812. It was like Thomas Jefferson's like last resort. It was to put economic pressure on Great Britain in order to protect U.S. shipping rights to the Mediterranean. Did I do that right? Yeah, the U.S. shipping rights to the Mediterranean, and it prohibited all U.S. foreign trade. All U.S. foreign trade. And had a devastating effect on the American economy and reduced trade and caused a sharp drop in exports. It was eventually repealed, but its effects on the U.S. economy were long-lasting. So really, it was made to like harm Britain, but it harmed us in the process.
So please come back tomorrow. A lot of people are asking what's going to be talked about. Tomorrow will be period 6 and 7. So that's the Gilded Age and modern America up to 1845. Wednesday night will be, Wednesday night will be periods 8 and 9. So that's the 20th and 21st centuries. And then Thursday will be our big finale. We're going to kind of go over everything again, answer a lot of your questions. And just build you guys up before the exam on Friday. So everyone take a deep breath, go get a snack, and we'll see you all back here tomorrow night.